For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. Witnessing the fury of an erupting volcano is to behold nature's raw, uncontrollable power. The ground shakes, molten lava flows, and the air chokes with ash. It is a spectacle of destruction that spares nothing in its path. To be caught near such a cataclysmic event is putting your life in grave danger against forces that show no mercy. Let's venture back to the merciless mountains, where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. Galeras Volcano, a prominent feature in the southwestern region of Colombia, is part of the Andean volcanic belt, a chain of volcanoes that stretches along the western edge of South America. Galeras, with its summit reaching an elevation of approximately 4,276 meters or 14,029 feet, stands as a sentinel over the city of Pasto, which lies about a few miles to the east. The volcano's imposing presence has been both a blessing and a curse for the region. Its fertile slopes support agriculture, but its eruptions pose a constant threat to the lives and livelihoods of the local population. Historically, Galeras has been one of Colombia's most active volcanoes, with a recorded history of eruptions dating back to pre-Columbian times. Recently, Galeras has seen a pattern of periodic eruptions. These eruptions varied in intensity, with some causing significant damage and loss of life. The 1989 eruption highlighted the volcano's potential for sudden and violent activity, prompting increased scientific interest and the establishment of more robust monitoring systems. Galeras is classified as a stratovolcano, characterized by its steep, conical shape formed by layers of hardened lava, tephra, pumice, and volcanic ash. This structure is typical of volcanoes that produce explosive eruptions as opposed to the more effusive eruptions of shield volcanoes. The volcano's frequent activity has necessitated extensive monitoring. This monitoring is crucial not only for scientific research, but also for the safety of the nearly 500,000 residents of Pasto and the surrounding areas. The Galeras volcano remains an important subject of study for volcanologists worldwide. It provides valuable insights into the processes that drive volcanic eruptions and how these natural events can be monitored and predicted. One of the most significant challenges in monitoring Galeras and volcanoes in general is the unpredictability of eruptions. While certain signs, such as increased seismic activity, changes in gas emissions, and ground deformation can indicate an impending eruption, these signals are not always present or easy to interpret. For Dr. Stanley Williams, his Galeras expedition would be a catastrophe. The year was 1993, and an air of excitement buzzed through the streets of Pasto. Volcanologists worldwide had gathered for the United Nations International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction Conference, an event dedicated to advancing the understanding of natural hazards and improving disaster preparedness. Among the attendees were some of the most distinguished names in the field of volcanology, eager to share their knowledge and learn from one another. The highlight of the conference was a planned field trip to the summit of Galeras, offering the scientists a rare opportunity to observe an active volcano up close. Stanley Williams, an American geologist renowned for his work on volcanic activity, was among those eagerly preparing for the ascent. The group, comprising international experts and local guides, planned to descend inside the caldera, driven by a shared passion for unraveling the mysteries of one of Earth's most dynamic systems. The Colombian government established extensive monitoring systems to track the volcano's gas emissions and seismic activity, including an observatory in Pasto and a station at the volcano's summit. Nestled in the Aras Valley and surrounded by mountains, Pasto, a charming enclave rich in history and natural beauty, had recently concluded its massive annual Blacks and Whites Carnival with the Dia de Qui, a celebration of the region's signature dish, roasted guinea pig. After 10 years of dormancy, Galeras reawakened in 1988. In July 1992, a small, screw-shaped line appeared on the seismograph, detecting tremors as magma pushed against the volcano's walls and gas pressure built up. The surrounding ground shook so severely that the town's residents could hear it humming and rumbling, one of the clearest signs that an eruption was imminent. Indeed, 5 days after the blip on the seismograph, Galeras erupted. Days later, the volcano fell silent again. During the period of activity, a mound of thick lava had accumulated at Galeras' summit, forming a lava dome that trapped gases inside the volcano. The July 1992 eruption blasted through the dome, releasing the built-up pressure and quieting Galeras again, believing that the volcano was dormant. Seizing the opportunity, the UN scheduled a research expedition. On January 13, 1993, 90 scientists at the conference eagerly signed up for field trips planned for the next day. The most coveted expedition was the data collection trip led by Dr. Stanley Williams, a geology professor at Arizona State University. Williams had been conducting research in Colombia since 1985. That November, when the Nevado del Ruiz volcano erupted, killing upwards of 20,000 people in Armero, Williams traveled there with the U.S. Geological Survey and quickly gained a reputation for being difficult. The U.S. Geological Survey aimed to support local officials after the tragedy, a mission Williams often defied by claiming the volcano would erupt again despite contrary scientific consensus. Williams believed gas emissions were a more reliable predictor of eruptions than seismic activity. Though Nevado del Ruiz did not erupt again, Williams continued to advocate for his controversial views. Despite his maverick reputation, he was respected among his peers in Colombia, and spots in his research group filled quickly. However, his longtime colleague Marta Calva, a native of Pasto, did not join him. Marta and other conference attendees were concerned about the expedition's safety in Galeras' crater due to the daily seismic activity detected at the Pasto Observatory. The scientists called these events tornillo, Spanish for screw, because of their pattern on the seismograph, the same pattern observed before Galeras' previous eruption. Dr. Williams dismissed their worries and that collecting gas samples was imperative. He assured his group the crater visit would be brief and it would be a safe expedition. But as many stories covered on this channel, the mountain would have different plans. The morning of January 14, 1993 was cool and overcast in Pasto. The group set off at 7:30 a.m. They climbed the winding road to the volcano's summit. The early morning mist turned into a heavy fog. Several journalists joined the long drive, bombarding the scientists with questions, particularly about when Galeras would erupt again. Stanley Williams' answer remained consistent. The volcano was tranquilo, Spanish for calm. Williams was confident that since the lava dome responsible for the last eruption was no longer present, gases were no longer being trapped in the volcano's throat. Regardless of the presence of a dome, Galeras was still susceptible to typical pressure buildups that caused the majority of volcanic activity. By 9 a.m., the field research groups had reached the summit, 14,000 feet or 4,200 meters above sea level. In the thick fog, the peak was surrounded by a solid gray mist. Geophysicists at the two-room monitoring station on the summit maintained contact with the observatory in Pasto, where seismic activity was monitored. Most of the 30 scientists from the conference began taking measurements around the volcano's outer rim, but Dr. Williams and the 12 other scientists in his group headed directly toward the deep crater at the summit's center. A freezing wind whipped over the ridge, making the scientists eager to descend into the warm, windless protection of the crater's walls. Just after 9:30 a.m., they began their descent. A yellow nylon rope cemented into the rocky ridge guided the researchers down the slope, a 100-foot or 30-meter drop to the next patch of level ground. From there, they could walk the rest of the way to the bottom of the crater. Due to the danger of dislodging rocks, they had to descend the rope one at a time. Jose Arles Zapata, a young Colombian volcanologist who had extensively studied Galeras, volunteered to go first. Next was Igor Menilov, a Russian scientist on his first trip to South America. Dr. Williams followed, then Jeff Brown, a British scientist. Next were Carlos Trujillo and Fernando Cuenca, both from Colombia. 3 Americans, Mike Conway, Andrew McFarlane, and Andy Adams, came next with 3 more Colombian scientists. Alfredo Roldán, Fabio Garcia, Carlos Estrada, and Luis Lemery would be the last to descend. Inside the vast crater, the scientists marveled at their surroundings. The flat depression at the mountain's top was 2,000 feet or 500 meters wide, and at its center, Steam rose from a 400-foot or 120-meter wide hole, the volcano's mouth. Being inside an active volcano's crater was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, especially for Jose Arles Zapata, who had devoted much of his life to studying Galeras. Alfredo Roldan joked, "Hey, Jose Arles, this isn't an active volcano. If you want an active volcano, you should see Pacaya." In turn, Dr. Stanley Williams teased Roldan and Andy Adams for wearing their safety gear. They were the only two men with hard hats. Most of the scientists hadn't even brought gas masks or safety goggles. Adams was irritated, as he had never been mocked for taking safety seriously, especially inside an active volcano. Unbelievably, the group had weighed the pros and cons of carrying safety gear and decided that good boots and warm clothing were all they needed. No one even carried emergency medical supplies. The lack of precautions extended further. Only one person in the entire party, Jose Arles Zapata, carried a radio. At the station, a student, not a trained professional, monitored the seismographs. Zapata had contacted this student, Adriana Ortega, before descending into the crater, and was pleased to hear that everything was quiet that morning. However, shortly after receiving that initial report, a tornillo appeared on the seismographs. It was small and seemingly insignificant, but policy dictated that the researchers in the crater be informed of any seismic activity, no matter how minor. Adriana tried to contact Zapata several times, but received no response. She ran outside to flag down her co-worker, Roberto Torres, who luckily reached Zapata with his radio and informed him about the tornillo. Zapata assured Torres they would wrap things up quickly, but when he relayed the update to the other scientists, they seemed unconcerned. Even the most safety-conscious members of the team continued to dawdle. Zapata was the only one worried, recalling their previous night's conversation about the frequent activity preceding Galeras' last eruption. He stood only a few hundred feet from the volcano's mouth, acutely aware of the growing pressure inside. After receiving confirmation of seismic activity at the Galeras Volcano, Jose Arles Zapata was eager to leave the crater as quickly as possible. However, despite their promises to wrap things up, his fellow scientists continued to take samples at a leisurely pace. Igor Menyalov was busy collecting gas samples from a fumarole, a hole in the volcano's surface releasing a 30-foot column of steam. Stanley Williams believed that a higher than usual concentration of sulfur dioxide in the gas indicated magma rising to the surface, signaling an imminent explosion. Although there had never been a successful prediction based on this analysis, Andy Adams, wearing his protective hard hat, hoped they would live to see the test results. He was relieved to realize he could collect all the samples he needed from the fumaroles on the outer edge of the crater's rim, as he was spooked by the idea of descending to the crater floor. Menyalov, more adventurous, walked right into the hottest and most dangerous part of the volcano's center, without a gas mask and with a cigarette dangling from his mouth. Dr. Williams was charmed by the Russian scientist's roguish attitude, though others were less thrilled. Zapata kept urging the team to hurry, but Williams, the group leader, encouraged them to take their time, savoring the rare opportunity to experience the volcano's grandeur. Williams climbed to the top of the crater's rim, looking down at the fumarole hundreds of feet below. It was steaming and smelled of sulfur, but it was magnificent. This was why he became a geologist, not for the long days in labs, poring over tables and charts, but for the exhilarating moments of field research, experiencing nature in all its terrifying beauty. As he watched the volcano breathe, the sun emerged for the first time all day, allowing the scientists to see Pasto's rooftops 14,000 feet or 4,200 meters below. They also noticed 3 unexpected guests climbing down the yellow nylon rope to join them. Around 12:45 p.m., Williams finally suggested they start heading back. Andy Adams, Alfredo Roldan, Carlos Estrada, and Fabio Garcia gathered their equipment and began the ascent. The journey out took twice as long as the descent, as they were now walking uphill, and the men were becoming exhausted. At about 1:40 p.m., Roldan heard a low rumbling that stopped him in his tracks. He asked Garcia if he had heard the sound. Garcia thought it might be normal rockfall, common at Galeras, but Roldan believed it sounded different. He had only heard that sound once before at the Guatemalan volcano Pacaya, just before it erupted. The four men hurried towards the yellow rope. Andy Adams was lagging behind, but Rodon decided not to wait for him and started his climb, letting the others catch up. When Rodon reached the summit at 1:45 p.m., he was ambushed by two reporters with a camera and microphone. Before he could catch his breath, one reporter asked for his impressions of the volcano. Rodon said the day had been a success and that Galeras was an ideal testing ground. Then the reporter asked the infamous question, "When do you think Galeras will erupt again?" Rodon glanced at the camera and said it could be a year from now, a month from now, or next week. At that moment, the video goes blank. The microphone picked up the sound of a loud explosion and three haunting screams from the crater. The steam rising from the volcano's mouth turned to dark smoke, ash, and a stream of glowing red rocks. The crater floor lurched back and forth, rumbling like subterranean thunder. A thick surge of black ash and red lava shot into the sky. One of the scientists cried out, "It's the volcano!" The low gas emissions and minor seismic activity hadn't indicated dormancy. The volcano had again sealed itself. The acidic gases from the July explosion had altered the rock, sealing fissures and allowing gases to build up, creating immense pressure that finally caused the volcano to explode. The 10 scientists still inside the crater didn't understand the warning signs until it was too late. Stanley Williams, watching from his perch on the crater's rim, saw the blast of lava and rock raining down on his colleagues. Igor Menyalov and 4 other researchers near the crater's center were almost certainly dead already. Andrew McFarlane, Louise Lemery, and Mike Conway were across the rim from Williams. Just behind Williams were Jose Arles Zapata and the 3 tourists. For a split second, Williams froze, thinking of his wife and 2 young children back home in Arizona. Then he turned and ran. Williams caught up with Zapata and the tourists, with Andrew McFarlane following close behind. Their only hope of survival was climbing the yellow nylon rope to the summit. Running was difficult, as the surface was now a mixture of soft ash and big boulders. Within seconds, the explosion launched meter-wide boulders hundreds of feet into the air, sending smaller rocks and glowing shrapnel raining down. Williams looked back to see a rock flying towards McFarlane, knocking him down into a pile of white-hot rock shards. McFarlane managed to pull himself up. His hands and arms burned raw from the scalding rocks. The 3 men kept running as the volcano shifted beneath them. Another blast launched a rock into Williams's head, knocking him to the ground and caving in part of his skull, driving bone fragments into his brain. Struggling to get up, Williams saw another glowing boulder careening towards Zapata's head, slamming him down into burning rubble. As Williams got closer, he saw Zapata's still bloody and contorted body. He was dead. Then Williams saw the tourists, their figures charred and burning. He felt neither sadness nor shock upon seeing the bodies. His only thought was that he needed to get out. Williams ran only a few more yards before a torrent of rocks struck his legs. The pain was unbearable as he tried to stand. Looking down, he saw his lower left leg engulfed in flames and his right foot nearly severed. Using only his left leg, he hopped over and took cover behind a large boulder, temporarily safe from the barrage of lava and rock. He stamped out the flames on his legs. The volcano erupted 3 more times in rapid succession, sending a massive plume of black ash into the sky and raining down burning rubble. Marta Calva, Williams's longtime colleague, realized that Williams and his group were still inside the crater. Though she was half a mile from the summit, she knew she was not safe, standing in a perfect location for a pyroclastic flow. Scientists inside the crater and on the summit worried about a possible pyroclastic flow. Still, some decided to stay put, reasoning that from their position they might be able to run to safety if a cloud of ash and lava was ejected. Down in the crater, 3 surviving scientists, Mike Conway, Andrew McFarlane, and Louise Lemery, made their own plans. All were horribly injured. Lemery had 2 broken legs and a broken collarbone. They agreed that staying in their sheltered area might be the best option. People rarely survive pyroclastic flows, but the best chance is to barricade yourself in an airtight building or depression and hold your breath until the smoke and gas pass. However, the blast settled down, and the 3 men decided to make a run for it. Stumbling through rubble and ash toward the crater wall, which was barely visible through the smoke, McFarlane understood people caught in a volcanic explosion had a 50% chance of survival. The yellow nylon rope was still hundreds of feet away, and reaching it seemed almost insurmountable. Suddenly, McFarlane heard a voice calling from behind a boulder. It was Dr. Williams, severely injured, with his right foot hanging on by a thread. He was crying out for help to stay conscious, fearing he would go into shock. McFarlane tried to help him, but both men's hands were severely burnt, making it impossible to grasp each other. Hoisting Williams up and carrying him up the crater wall was impossible. McFarlane had no choice but to leave his injured colleague, who was somewhat protected by the boulder. As they continued to the rope, Conway began to say to himself repeatedly, "We won't all die." They finally reached the rope, and Conway, the least injured, went up first. McFarlane and Lemery struggled after him. McFarlane's charred palms could barely grasp the rope, and Lemery's broken legs made every step unbearably painful. When Conway reached the top, he pushed past the news crew who were still covering the story of a lifetime and bounded toward the two-room observation station at the summit. The people inside were shocked to see him alive. Conway insisted on a rescue crew, but decided not to mention that some people were dead, fearing it would deter rescuers. Half a mile from the summit, Marta Calva and her research group were in tears, knowing their friends and colleagues were still in the crater. Marta radioed the observatory in Pasto, announcing her intention to go to the summit. The observatory scientists warned her against it, but Marta couldn't stand by and do nothing. She sent the rest of her group back to Pasto and went alone. Another researcher, Patty Moths, insisted on joining her. The two women began their treacherous drive up the summit toward the epicenter of the eruption in near-complete silence, broken only by Marta's radio communications with the observatory. They knew little except that dozens of researchers were missing, injured, or presumed dead. Halfway up, Marta and Patty encountered a jeep of military police and national park workers fleeing the summit. Marta flagged them down and urged them to turn around and help. Despite protocol dictating evacuation, the men felt ashamed watching the two scientists venture into danger while they fled to safety. Down in the crater, Dr. Stanley Williams was still alone, shivering, and near unconsciousness. It had been just over an hour since the eruption, and with only 3 hours of daylight left, he knew he wouldn't make it through the night in his condition. Williams began to cry, calling for help in English and Spanish, but there was no response. His colleagues had either escaped or were dead. He wondered if anyone would risk their life to save him. He believed that the one person who would risk everything to save others was Marta Calva. Despite all odds, she was making her way up to the summit. It was 3 p.m. and an hour past the eruption when geologists Patty Moths and Marta Calva were driving their jeep up the slope. Getting closer to the volcano's mouth with the two military police officers they picked up along the way riding, all terrified about venturing into the heart of the disaster. Upon reaching the summit, Patty and Marta were confronted with the eruption's aftermath. Cars had been crushed by falling rocks, and white-hot rocks still hissed on the ground. The police station at the summit was smashed to pieces by debris. Staggering out of the smoke was their fellow scientist, Andy Adams, who had just crawled out of the crater himself. Andy informed Marta and Patty that there were still men trapped below who were alive. Patty approached the crater's rim, stunned by the raging, fiery pit below. It seemed impossible that anyone could survive, but then she heard a faint, gravelly voice calling from the wreckage, her mentor and friend, Stanley Williams. Patty and Marta knew what they had to do: climb down into the mouth of the active Galeras Volcano. Williams was lying behind a boulder, completely immobile. His leg was broken, the bone jutting out through his charred clothes, and one of his feet was nearly severed. His body shook violently, going into shock from massive blood loss. It took all his effort to stay conscious. The soldiers who had driven up with Marta and Patty refused to descend into the crater. It was against regulations and common sense to climb into the smoldering inferno before being sure the eruption was over. The TV news crews, who were unbelievably still waiting on the summit, weren't eager to help either, but Marta and Patty were determined. As they prepared for the descent, another car arrived. Out hopped 3 men eager to join them: Ricardo Villota, Milton Ordonez, and Carlos Estrada, researchers with the Colombian Geological Survey. They had also ignored warnings and driven up to help with the rescue. The 3 men followed Marta and Patty down the steep crater wall. Halfway down, Carlos saw a man stranded on the rocky slope, covered in blood and ash. It was Luis Lemery. Lemery, Andy McFarlane, and Mike Conway had all been on the inner crater's rim when the eruption began. They managed to reach the yellow nylon rope leading up the slope to the summit, but only Conway could pull himself up. He made it to safety shortly before the rescuers arrived. Lemery followed, but with 2 broken legs and a broken clavicle. He couldn't pull himself up the steep rock wall. Carlos dragged Lemery the rest of the way up. Back in the crater, Marta, Patty, Milton, and Ricardo ventured further down. They found another man lying in the rubble, shaking violently. It was Andy McFarlane. McFarlane had tried to follow Conway and Lemery up the crater wall, but collapsed from exhaustion. His palms had been burned off from falling into the white-hot rubble. A falling rock fractured his skull, and his body was quickly going into shock from blood loss. The 4 scientists rushed to grab McFarlane, who was covered in blood and deathly pale. It took all 4 to carry him up the path, navigating boulders and debris. Luckily, by 3:15 p.m., a rescue team from the Red Cross had arrived with medical supplies. The paramedics secured ropes to a metal stretcher and lowered it down to help transport survivors. Once McFarlane was on the stretcher, the men on the rim pulled him up. Marta and Patty climbed back down to continue the search. There was still no sign of Dr. Williams, even though Patty had heard him shouting. Even if they found him, it might be too late. Marta kept in contact with the observatory in Pasto as they ventured further into the cone. The observatory warned her that Galeras was showing seismic activity again, and they should leave immediately, but Marta was determined not to abandon her colleagues. Gray ash covered everything, making it impossible to distinguish a human body from rubble. Amid the monochromatic landscape, Ricardo noticed a sliver of yellow. From 90 meters away, he recognized it as Jose Arles Zapata's coat. But as Ricardo approached, he saw that Zapata's skull was completely gone, exposing his brain. Ricardo refused to believe it, but as he lifted Zapata's head, the brain fell out. Inconsolable, Ricardo had to be snapped out of it by Milton. They pressed on, finding more horror. The brutalized bodies of 3 tourists were next, followed by a barely recognizable body thought to be Carlos Trujillo. There was no trace of Igor Minyalov, Nestor Garcia, Jeff Brown, or Fernando Cuenca. But then, they heard a weak voice begging for help. It was Stanley Williams. Dr. Williams was huddled behind a boulder, buried under ash. He had given up hope of being found, his throat so dry he could barely call for help. He was losing blood and consciousness fast. Marta and Milton hurried over. The first thing they noticed was Williams' leg, with a broken bone poking through his pants. Milton used a foam cooler to fashion a makeshift splint. The 4 scientists lifted Williams onto a blanket and hoisted him up, each carrying a corner. Every stumble made Williams cry out in pain, but it meant he was still conscious. Williams was found only a quarter mile from the crater wall, but the grueling journey over rubble took almost 2 hours when they reached the bottom of the slope. Around 6 p.m., a team of rescue workers was waiting and were stunned by Williams' condition. One medic tried to remove his bloodied cap, revealing his crushed skull with his brain exposed. They tried to protect his head as much as possible and made a more stable brace for his leg. Finally, they transferred him to a steel stretcher and signaled to the workers on the rim to pull him up. Despite the new brace, Williams screamed in pain every time the stretcher jostled. After making it up the 200-foot or 60-meter slope, a helicopter awaited him to the hospital. Williams was shivering violently, his body temperature dangerously low from the massive blood loss. The last thing he remembered hearing before the helicopter took off was Patty telling the pilot to turn the heat on high. As Williams lifted off, Patty and Marta stood on the ridge, looking down at Pasto 5,000 feet or 1,500 meters below as dusk began to fall. 4 survivors had been discovered, but 2 colleagues had died, and another 4 would never be found. When the helicopter returned, Patty and Marta climbed in silently and flew away. The rescue effort was over. All the survivors suffered burns on their skin where they had come into contact with hot rock. Burns on the hands were particularly problematic. After falling, survivors tried to scramble over the ground, coming into contact with scattered hot rock fragments. Gases were not an issue. The light rain and ashfall contributed to wetting and dirtying the skin, which increased body cooling and fatigue. 4 survivors were admitted to the hospital. The most severely injured was Stanley Williams, who had a depressed fracture on the left side of his skull, jaw, and temporal bone, affecting his middle ear. His right leg had sustained a compound, comminuted fracture of the tibia and fibula, and a rock had also fractured his left fibula. He had burns on his legs, arms, and hands, with a large, full-thickness burn on his back. His legs required skin grafts, and the burn on his back was excised. He also had numerous contusions and minor lacerations from rock impacts on his back, buttocks, and legs. That night, an emergency craniotomy was performed to remove fragments of his skull bone and a small subdural hematoma. He was flown out of Pasto to the United States by air ambulance 2 days later and underwent numerous reconstructive surgeries on his right leg and skull for over a year afterward. Carlos Trujillo perished in a blast of intense heat, leaving only a charred, mutilated head and torso. Nestor Garcia and Igor Menyailov, who were both in the crater at the time of the eruption, were instantly vaporized, leaving no trace behind. Jeff Brown and Fernando Cuenca, who were near Trujillo at the crater's edge, also vanished without a trace. Jose Arles Zapata and the 3 tourists were killed by flying rocks, traveling at bullet-like speeds. Williams and 3 others, who were standing close to Zapata, were lucky not to bring the number of deaths from 9 to 13. Williams came closest to sharing the fate of Arles and the tourists. In the years following the eruption, Williams has become a well-known figure, but he has also made enemies. The controversies surrounding his personality and the events at Galeras have spread beyond the small circle of volcanology, fueled by the publication of 2 books about the 1993 incident. One book, Surviving Galeras, is Williams' own account, co-written with Fen Montaigne. The other, No Apparent Danger, is authored by Victoria Bruce, a geology graduate and science writer. Bruce's book accuses Williams of recklessly leading a group to the summit of Galeras without safety helmets, protective suits, or an emergency escape plan, despite evidence suggesting an imminent eruption. These are serious allegations, which Williams denies. He challenges the idea that a few blips on local seismographs were sufficient warning of impending danger. While he acknowledges that active volcanoes are inherently dangerous, he insists that everyone in the group was fully aware of the risks. He also argues that the title of Bruce's book is misleading. Everybody who went there knew they were going to a dangerous volcano. That was the whole point. I was very careful to include some of the world's experts in volcanic earthquakes. In meetings we had, we talked to each other, we had looked at the records, and in the days before the fatal eruption, several different people had talked about the activity of Galeras to Colombian scientists who'd lived there for 25 years. Even if we'd been crazy and refused to listen to their warnings, would they have allowed their close friends to go into a ridiculously dangerous place that day? He says. Hard hats could have saved lives and his head, Williams admits. He wears one on volcanoes now. He believes that America theoretically celebrates risk-takers but is quick to sue when specific risks materialize. Since the eruption, Williams has become partially deaf, walks with difficulty on extensively reconstructed legs, suffers from depression and uncontrollable anger, mixes up words, and struggles with the higher-level abstract thinking essential for scientists. He does not accept guilt for the 9 deaths at Galeras. Still, he acknowledges responsibility for his post-eruption behavior, during which he portrayed himself as the sole survivor of the disaster. In reality, at least 3 others, Mike Conway, Andrew McFarlane, and Luis Lamery, were near him when the crater exploded and were injured while fleeing. He struggles to explain why he did this. Colleagues have publicly criticized him, accusing him of stealing research and describing him as aggressive and abrasive, allegations he denies. In a mea culpa in his book, he admits that his fame fed my not inconsiderable ego. He believes he emphasized the lone survivor image because the experience on the volcano that day profoundly changed him. The original Stanley Williams, a competent scientist, eager to ensure the safety of the 500 million people living near volcanoes, did not return from Galeras. I'm different. That guy died. I have to accept that, he declared. Galeras remains the most active volcano in Colombia. Since the disaster in 1993, it has had numerous eruptions in the 21st century, including a significant one in 2008 that resulted in no injuries or major damage. On February 14th, 2009, another eruption prompted the evacuation of 8,000 residents. Pasto was blanketed in ash from the explosion, and local authorities shut down 2 nearby water treatment plants. There have been 3 more major eruptions since then, with the latest occurring in August 2010. Since then, Galeras has been quiet, but another eruption is on the horizon. To this day, Dr. Stanley Williams still teaches at Arizona State. Williams has revisited Galeras since 1993, though one planned trip was aborted due to another eruption. Reflecting on his return to the scene of the disaster, he stated, "In 1995, Galeras finally let me back inside its crater. I was in and out in 2 hours. I came down with pneumonia. Basically, it was my not being strong enough to handle that effort. I shouldn't have done it. It wasn't an unbelievable facing God kind of thing. I'm just not that sensitive, I guess. I wanted to go back there. I wanted to go back and stand on that spot and think about Igor smiling, Jeff waving at me, and me just explaining to the tourists what was going on. And a minute later, everyone died. I don't have any sense of guilt for the deaths, but I miss them. It's a very sad thing." Volcanoes are the Earth's pressure valves, releasing pent-up energy in violent bursts. The searing heat can melt rock, and pyroclastic flows move with terrifying speed, incinerating everything they touch. Toxic gases billow out, suffocating the unwary. The ash cloud, thick and dark, can blot out the sun, turning day into night and causing respiratory illnesses long after the lava has cooled. Survival near an erupting volcano demands respect for its power and an unwavering sense of urgency. Inaction or underestimation can lead to tragic consequences. When entering an active volcano, safety should be your top priority. Understand the specific hazards of the volcano you plan to visit, including the types of eruptions it is prone to and its recent activity. Wear the proper protective gear, such as appropriate clothing, a helmet, goggles, and a mask. Emergency supplies include non-perishable food, water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. Carry a 2-way radio or a fully charged cell phone. Continuously monitor the environment for signs of increased volcanic activity, such as rumbling, gas emissions, or ground vibrations. Familiarize yourself with the evacuation routes and safe zones before entering the area. Be prepared to leave quickly if conditions deteriorate. Avoid the crater rim, which can be unstable and prone to collapse. If you find yourself caught inside a volcano during an eruption, keep calm. Panic can hinder your ability to think clearly and act quickly. Look around and determine the immediate hazards, such as falling ash, lava flows, or flying debris. Seek shelter behind sturdy objects to protect yourself from falling debris and ash. Use a cloth, mask, or any available fabric to cover your mouth and nose. Wet the cloth, if possible, to help filter out ash particles. Cover as much skin as possible with long sleeves, pants, and a hat. Move away from the crater. Move downhill and upwind to avoid lava flows and ash clouds. Stay out of valleys and low-lying areas where lava and pyroclastic flows can travel quickly. Volcanic eruptions can trigger earthquakes. Be prepared for shaking and falling objects. Be aware of potential landslides and move away from steep slopes. Use any available means to signal for help, such as shouting, using a whistle, or signaling with a flashlight or bright clothing. In the face of such overwhelming natural might, human resilience and preparedness are our only defenses. Stay informed, stay alert, and never become complacent. The danger is real and the stakes are high. Only through respect and readiness can we hope to endure and overcome an outdoor disaster. Thank you for watching. Want more outdoor disaster content? Check out these stories I believe you'll enjoy.